And now, it's the Finding Your Spine podcast with host Chase Spears.
Hello everyone, welcome back to the Finding Your Spine podcast, where we call men and women of moral principle to get out from behind the curtain and to stand boldly in their lives and leadership. I'm joined today by a guy who I've been following for a lot of years, whose work I absolutely admire. This guy has spine to spare, a man named Mark Bashaw. Mark, I've been watching you for the last probably 4 years. And from a distance, was recently able to get acquainted with you a little bit. And man, I'm really honored that you're taking the time to be with us today. You've got one heck of a story, and I'm excited about you sharing it here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Chase.
Yeah, so let me go ahead and do a little bit of a bio. You served for 17 years in the military, both on the Air Force side and the Army side as a medical service corps officer. You held high leadership roles in preventative medicine and entomology. One thing we have in common, we both served as company commanders for a headquarters company. Yours was for the Army Public Health Center headquarters at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Mark raised legal concerns over the Department of Defense's enforcement of experimental emergency use authorization products, such as masks, injections, and all the diagnostic tests that were forced on military service members. His protected communications included multiple Article 138 Uniform Code of Military Justice complaints, whistleblower declarations, and religious accommodation requests. Even though everything Mark did was according to the law, he was subjected to a sweeping campaign of retaliation from his leadership. On April 29, 2022, Mark became the only military member convicted in a court-martial for refusing to comply with the COVID-19 tyranny. He was then pardoned by President Trump on May 28th of this year. From the very beginning, Mark has been a steadfast, forceful voice for constitutional, legal, and moral rights of military members to resist unlawful medical orders. And he continues speaking out today to advocate for the correction of his military record, full reinstatement, and legal accountability for the officers involved in unlawful retaliation against not only himself, but also other military members who did their duty in trying to warn commanders about the illegal nature of their COVID-related orders. He's a man who stands head and shoulders above most others in the ranks, and I'm honored to have you here, buddy.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Chase. Thanks for having me.
You betcha. I first learned about you through the news, as you've probably heard before. Our paths didn't cross while we were on active duty, but I learned about the fact that you were a military officer being court-martialed, and it really came to a head when your prosecuting attorney bragged about your conviction on X. And we'll get to that here in a little bit, but I was just amazed at watching everything the Army threw at you and the fact that you remained completely unmoved. You remained completely on point. You were completely resolved that no matter what they do, up to terminating your Army career, which you'd worked so hard for, you were going to stand for what was right. And that was so rare among so many other people I knew. And so, with that said, tell us a little bit about your background and how you grew up and how you came to be a man of such conviction.
Yeah, so I grew up in Newbury, Massachusetts, Old Town Newbury, Massachusetts, founded in 1620. Really old town that we have in the Northeast. I joined the military right out of high school. So right after I graduated high school, joined at 19 years old, enlisted, went directly in the Air Force boot camp. And then I spent the next 10 years overseas serving in the Air Force active duty, spent my time at places like Japan, Germany, Middle East, Africa, South Korea, Central America, and climbed through the ranks in the Air Force in civil engineer squadrons as pest management, entomologist, and did a lot of stuff related to public health, medical entomology, and vector-borne disease. And then in 2019, after I completed my master's degree in entomology, I did a direct commission into the Medical Service Corps of the Army as a medical entomologist. And my first duty station, they sent me to Army Public Health Center January 2020. And at that point in time, I served in the entomological science division, doing risk communication strategies for vector-borne disease specifically. And then like you alluded to, I got selected for HHC company commander at Army Public Health Center. And so I did that for from May of 2020 until July of 2021. And then I went back into preventive medicine and medical entomology again, and to continue risk communication strategy. And that's kind of where it all kind of blew up when the mandate came out in August 2024. I was attempting to communicate the risks associated with these experimental emergency use authorized products. They then, in November, the Army specifically put out a FRAGO weaponizing the masking and the testing against the unvaccinated, the quote unquote unvaccinated, or the religiously convicted service members who didn't want to participate with the injections. And so at that point in time, filed Article 138 against my commander, trying to push the redress, trying to push the risk communication, proper risk communication about these things up the chain of command, and also the legalities of the orders, because we all know these were emergency use authorized products, the jabs, the testing, the masking, and part of the federal law requires service members must be given the option to accept or refuse those products. So it's kind of a little bit of a extended background on me.
And so can you, for our listeners, can you tell a little bit about what the Article 138 process is and what was the purpose of using that, and how does that legally allow us to seek redress when we're given illegal orders? Yeah,
so you mentioned, you kind of talked about why I had such a quote-unquote spine, or why I was so adamant throughout this process. And that, I would argue, that goes back to my military training and the chain of command. And throughout my military service, it's always been execute and utilize your chain of command. And part of that is effective communication. And so when we're performing redress, whether it's trying to get our airmen or soldiers corrective action, there's a communication avenue for that approach. But on the flip side of that, if there's an issue with a subordinate and their supervisor, whether it's a commander or direct supervisor, NCO, whatever that may be, there's also a line of communication where that service member can perform redress of grievance. First, obviously, it goes back to kind of biblical principles where you want to go to the person individually, face to one-on-one, and explain your issues to perform a redress. And if that doesn't work, then you move it to a little bit more formal setting, maybe an email, and then a more formal setting after that, after there was no redress, which was the Article 138, because in this case, it was the weaponization of medical products against service members, specifically myself, with the masking and the testing against the quote-unquote unvaccinated. So at that point in time, I tried all these things, bring in a witness, tried to one-on-one with the commander, showed him the laws, showed him the EUA laws, showed him the vaccine adverse event reporting system, and at public health, that's kind of a big deal for risk communication. And none of that, all of it was falling on deaf ears. None of it was being redressed. And so at that point in time, I had a duty to continue further up the chain of command, formally filing an Article 138 with the commanding general at the base. And a day prior to the adjudication of that Article 138, they signed off on the court-martial against me because I showed up to my place of duty unmasked, unvaccinated, untested. And so at that point in time, they banned me from all Army Public Health Center facilities. They withheld my security clearance. They flagged me from promotion, right? All these things they do in the military when you get flagged. But the problem was all that protected communication was already pushing through the chain of command. And they had this. They had their hands on this protected communication. So it was their duty to adjudicate that versus charge me with Article 92, refusing to obey orders, which we now know, we knew then, but which the Department of Defense has since come out and said these were unlawfully implemented. These were unlawful orders, right? And so eventually it just went to court-martial and, continued to progress from there.
I'm thinking back to a few months ago, we had the confirmation hearing for Matthew Lohmeyer to be the Undersecretary of the Air Force. And one of the criticisms that he received there in his confirmation hearing was, I can't remember, I want to say it was Senator Hirono from Hawaii. I could be wrong about that, but it was one of the senators on the Democratic side saying, saying, well, you wrote your book and you did this and you did that, but did you follow this process and that process and that process? And I remember watching that, thinking to myself, it's really nice that you had your staff do some research on all the myriad of processes that military members are afforded. But at the end of the day, we have learned over the last few years, and as it turned out, Matt had done everything that he knew to do properly. He's a smart guy. But they have all these processes. But at the end of the day, that process is dependent upon an honest broker on the other side of that process. If you have a dishonest broker on the other side of that process, all you're doing is a paperwork drill. And that's what I saw. That's what I experienced in my career. And it sounds like you probably had a little bit of that yourself.
Yeah, isn't it ironic that she brought up the processes to redress grievances on how a military member should do it, right? With that confirmation hearing, yet she doesn't want to entertain or look at all of the tens of thousands of service members who executed that process with their chain of command with the unlawful COVID-19 mandates, right? It's clearly only when it's politically expedient for the broker, as you called it, that they'll actually do anything about it. But we're not talking about politics here. We're talking about principle. We're talking about laws and orders, lawful orders, unlawful orders, and a service member's duty to conduct themselves in those environments. And that's what this is about. This isn't about politics. This isn't about, just all that other distractive stuff. This is black and white. The laws were black and white. They were violated. They were broke. There's plenty of evidence to show that. And at the end of the day, we have a responsibility as subordinates to our higher ranking leaders within the military to communicate properly with them, because ultimately, at the end of the day, we want them to do the right thing. We don't want to find them in a position where they're violating the law. That's the whole reason for these processes.
Yeah, it's, the law is only so good as that we are willing to execute it lawfully. And I know that sounds almost like a silly, obvious thing to say. But I was just blown away during my last few years in the military. It overlaps with your last years in the military, of how this organization that likes to talk about policies and regulation, like every time we take a physical fitness test, they literally read verbatim the regulation to you so that no one has any question what a proper push-up is supposed to look like, as if we could forget. But you bring up actual laws to them and constitutionality and even military regulation when it comes to medicine. And it just fell on such deaf ears. It just blew my mind. I'm reminded of, there's a statement that I kind of said a lot when I was a younger troop about how look around at the sergeants major or the commanders who talk the most about standards, and you'll find that they're the ones probably the least in accordance with them.
Yep. Yeah. And it goes back to a bigger picture, to a more systemic issue that we were dealing with during this time period. And it's more of a higher perspective, like a 40,000 foot view on the situation. I would call it, what we saw in January 2020 was an installation of a foreign belligerent occupation. And the reason why I say that is you can look at the fraudulent election system, which the fraud that happened on the election system, and you can say that is in fact an act of war, because that is national security infrastructure. There was fraud involved, And then what did we see after that? January 2021, we saw the installation of a foreign belligerent occupation. Only after, and the belligerent word's important, only after they started pushing down unlawful orders and subversion of the entire military apparatus, whether it's DEI, right? Whether it's the unlawful mandates weaponizing emergency use authorized products against service members that have the absolute right to refuse these products, which is codified by an act of Congress, which they blatantly and belligerently ignored, right? Or it's the Afghanistan withdrawal, right? We just had the anniversary of that, the belligerent, just ridiculous nature of that withdrawal, which got service members killed. You know, there's a lot of examples of belligerence. And then at the end of the day, foreign belligerent occupying power, you know, that's kind of the 40,000 foot view that I now looking back see and kind of was seeing throughout, but building upon the evidence of the illegalities, unlawfulness, and the belligerence as it played out added more credibility to that phrase of foreign belligerent occupying power.
Yeah, Mark, I'm convinced that what we saw from 2020 on, at least when it comes to military policy, was not nearly so much an effort at misguided commanders making horrible decisions about, so-called force protection. I think there were a handful of people, in the middle of the ranks who probably thought they were doing the right thing. I think there were a lot of people who knew they weren't. I think there are a lot of people who had no clue. So I think there's different levels of somewhere between ignorance and malevolence, depending on where you're at and who the individual is. But the more I study this, the more conversations like this that I have with people, the more that I read into what happened and really go back and start checking the documentation and finding out what people knew when, the more convinced I am that there was absolutely at least a part of this at some levels, a loyalty test. Who will do what I tell them to do? And I'm kind of curious what you think about that.
I agree. I think it was a huge litmus test, but at the same time, as service members, we individually take an oath of enlistment or an oath of office. And, it goes back to what you said, like, were they knowingly, unknowingly, and I agree with you. I don't think majority of commands knowingly, were nefariously and pushing down belligerence and illegal activity and unlawfulness. However, the distinction changes when a service member brings protected communication to their chain of command and is formally communicated within that chain of command. The commander can no longer say they didn't know. And I'm sorry, but your legal advisor and your medical advisor are not going to dig you out of this hole, because one of the responsibilities as commander, that's one of the greatest responsibilities as commander in the military. Why is that? Because at the end of the day, you take the responsibility for your actions and your orders you levy upon your subordinates. And so all of these service members who had any sort of protected communication, and I want to bring up what is protected communication in the military. Well, it's codified, it's specified with each branch in Army regulation, in Air Force regulation, in Naval regulation. And what is it? It's any violation of military regulation, any violation of federal law, and specific or substantial dangers to public health and safety. If any of that is communicated or even perceived to be communicated to anyone in the chain of command, that is a protected communicator. You must work with that service member to push that up higher and try to alleviate the issues that are brought forth, right? You do not, but instead, what did we see? We saw this mass retaliation and reprisal against the individual with all these unlawful discharges, with, court-martials banning from their place of duties, right? And so that's one of the biggest things is I don't think majority of, service members knowingly, carried this out. But there are ones who knowingly carried it out, and we have the evidence for those individuals who knowingly carried it out. So, that's important. We all have a duty. We all have an important task and mission. It starts individually first, like I alluded to with the oath. So you either carry out your oath and execute your mission, or you don't. And I'm not saying every service member has to freaking evaluate every order that comes down from their chain of command. They shouldn't. They shouldn't have to. But that's why officers are in an important role. Specifically, commanders are in an important role. And what we saw was a blind adherence to their legalese or their legal advisors that weren't willing to, for whatever reason, read the EUA federal laws on the books. I don't know. It's beyond me. That's why I go back to foreign belligerent occupation, because it was just so belligerent at every single level.
When you really stomped on an issue there, that's something that has my attention of late, and that's the oath to the Constitution. And we all swear on it. I remember swearing to it when I first came in 20 plus years ago as an enlisted E4. I swore it again every time I promoted as an officer. And even then, there were times I thought, this is interesting that we all swear to this. I'm looking around the room, and I'm like, I bet most people in this room probably haven't read the Constitution. And I went through a 20-year career, and one time received what the military would say is a block of constitutional training. It was later in my career. I want to say it was like around 2014, 2015. I was in U.S. Army Alaska at the time, and there was a requirement that all the guys and gals in U.S. Army Alaska on Constitution Day had to log onto this website and do their constitutional training, which, is, as I recall, was a short, no more than like 10-minute kind of animated video. These truths are self-evident. Reading some phrases, but it wasn't really here's what your Constitution is and what it means and what your oath means. And now I've been out for a couple of years, and I've had more time to reflect on it, and I've done a lot of writing and research and study into this, and I can't help but notice the fact that we train a lot of things every single year. Like if you miss your equal opportunity training, man, heaven help you. If you miss your SHARP, sexual harassment prevention training, someone will be coming and tapping you on the shoulder. Why weren't you at the briefing? Get in there. If you're late on a physical fitness test, again, you'll know about it. All these things, some of them are important. Most of them are rather ancillary. And some of them are downright activism. And yet we swear this oath, and we don't expect military members to actually know what in the world they're swearing to. And I think that's incredibly problematic as a citizen.
Yeah, it's, I think it's purposeful. I mean, I don't think they actually want a service member to have that knowledge and training in the oath and their, what they're swearing to. I always go back to the most important thing about the oath. And again, this is my opinion, right? I think the most important thing about the oath is the last four words, so help me God. Because I wouldn't have been able to do my duty and do what I had to do without help from God Almighty. And I just think I think it's really interesting why those four words are at the end of the oath of enlistment and oath of office, right? And I think your discernment and your power is derived from God Almighty. And in order to secure the Constitution, in my opinion, it requires discernment. And I feel that it's God-given discernment that it requires for you to be able to carry out and conduct securing the Constitution against enemies, foreign and domestic. That's, again, there's a bunch of people that might, there's a bunch of people that will say, well, that's an optional statement. That's an optional statement. No, I disagree. I don't think that's an optional statement, because the last 5 years was a great test to show who was willing to actually stand in that gap and who wasn't. I don't know. There's going to be a lot of people that disagree with me on that, and that's fine. But it is what it is. So help me God.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that there's a reason that's in the oath, and it that is not an optional part. I do know at the very beginning, people are allowed based on conviction to say, rather than I solemnly swear, that I do so affirm. But that's the that's the only wiggle room in the rank and in the oath. And I have wondered over the years, okay, what if you're someone who very openly doesn't believe in God? Am I supposed to believe that you actually mean the rest of your oath if you don't mean the end of it?
And that's the beautiful thing about our Constitution. It's like, and the way our government is, or the way our republic works, right? Or the way it's supposed to work, how it's supposed to be, right? Goes back to, Genesis in the Bible. God created man and woman, right? Gave them dominion. And so the proper chain of authority in this situation is God, man, society, government on bottom, right? So if you as a man or woman aren't willing to individually stand up for your unalienable rights and liberties, right, that are given you and bestowed upon you by God Almighty, how could you possibly secure the Constitution when push comes to shove? That's just my thoughts. And it's just ironic too that the entire military disregarded a huge chunk of the First Amendment during the whole, what I call, pandemic. And part of the Constitution says, it's really funny, because the Constitution says there shall be no religious test for military service, right? Yet they took all of the religiously convicted service members who did not, based upon their convictions and conscience, right, did not want to participate with an experimental injection for whatever reason, and I don't really need to know their reason, right? It's not my business. But they had to go to the chaplain to get a religious test, to test them on their religiosity or their religion or whatever it is, right? Spirituality, whatever you want to call it. Religion, freedom of religion. And they had to get a test to see if it was sincerely held. How is that not a violation of the Constitution in itself? Not only are we denying the mass individuals freedom of religion that they swear an oath to defend, but now we're putting them through religious tests to participate with the pseudoscience of what looks to be like another religion, because if we look at the whole psychological attitudes, perceptions, and beliefs towards the vaccines, it was very much a dogma of a religion, with no actual science to back up what they were saying, like safe and effective. You can't just say safe and effective if there's government data that shows, hey, we've got some serious issues here with the VAERS and the adverse events and the deaths associated. And then on top of that, in the military, we also had the DMED database that I was keenly privy of. So, just hypocrisy all around on that whole situation. I think that's another interesting way to look at it. It's just ridiculous. Belligerence.
There was a lot of that. Let's go back now to kind of your time in the service, and we've talked a lot on the show. I've had a lot of episodes on this topic. It's I'm a dog with a bone, and I'm not letting it go until DoD does the right thing. I think it's important to keep telling these stories for historical record. But so I've had a lot of folks here on the show. We've talked about the shot. Your story goes actually a lot wider and talks about the fact that even the masks and these, COVID tests, these, nasal assaults, as it felt like, were themselves experimental use authorization as well. And I hadn't realized that before.
Right. All of your case rates were coming out of a experimental emergency use authorized testing protocol, whether it was the PCR test or the rapid antigen test kits they handed out like candy, or you had to go to a store and buy off the shelf, right, at a CVS. And they still sell them to this day, right? That whole case rate was built on an experimental emergency use authorized testing protocol. And, oh, by the way, if you ramp up the PCR cycle threshold more than 35 cycle thresholds, which for the layman out there, a cycle threshold is basically a magnification of your sample size. So what they'll do is you'll shove that Q-tip on your nose. They'll take that sample, they'll run it in a PCR test and magnify it to a certain level. But if you magnify it more than 35, you get an immense amount of false positives. So we had this inflation and the psychological aspect of information being fed to a mainstream media apparatus through the medical, what I call medical military industrial complex, to show the case rates and the death rates, right? All of those were from a experimental diagnostic. That it's also odd that flu completely disappeared during, I want to say it was 2020 to 2022 timeframe, significant drastic decrease in the flu sickness or the common cold. Well, where did it go? Where did those case rates go? Right? And so even in the military, you had Frago 6, specifically a fragmentary order in the Army. That's what it's called, a fragmentary order. After they mandated the experimental vaccine upon service members, in order to fracture the force even more, they came out with what was called fragmentary order number 6, which said, if you're an unvaccinated, a quote unquote unvaccinated Department of the Army civilian, soldier, whatever, you now have to go through testing every single week in order to gain access to your place of duty. That outed you and your status and your medical status of wanting to participate or not with this highly politicized experimental injection at the time, right? And so what would happen is your name would get put on a roster and your entire surroundings of your work center would understand, based on the fact that you had to go through mandatory testing to gain access to your facility, your federal facility, to perform your assigned and appointed duty location. You would be outed to your entire surroundings. So now you've got people looking at you weird, treating you weird, all of these things because they now know your medical status, right? And that was the biggest, my biggest issue was that. And then there was a point in time where they came out with a carrot, and the carrot was, and the Army specifically did this, and at each bases at a high level as well, they said, if you get the jab, you don't have to wear a mask anymore, right? And so a lot of people jumped and got the jab because they were sick and tired of wearing the mask, right? And then all of a sudden they retracted like a month later and said, oh, you know what? Everybody's going to wear a mask now, right? And so all these people are like, wait a second, why the carrot, right? And then came the stick. And the stick, again, was what I said. If you were unvaccinated, now you had to mask and test. You were highly segregated, and, the whole force was ripped apart. But the masking, let me speak on the masking for a second, because that's an interesting concept. The masking, again, was also emergency use authorized. And a lot of these facilities, specifically the medical facilities on these American, United States military installations were procuring masks from China. From an occupational health standpoint, I mean, were there no red flags there? Like, what are the materials being used for these masks? Like, and again, this was like 2 years into a pandemic, which we already knew was highly overinflated in every aspect. Yet, and we also knew that masking didn't work. Yet we're forcing medical personnel, medical facilities, military personnel to wear Chinese-made masks. And what was funny about that, if you wore like a neck gaiter, they would say, "Oh no, that's not allowed. You have to use one of these." It's like the neck gaiter was made in America, right? And the mask was made in China. Like, from a military standpoint, like, are we, and a medical and an occupational health and an environmental health type aspect, like, no, nothing. Like, we don't see an issue there where there could possibly be an issue, especially if we're talking about like biological warfare. No, I mean, some people say, "Oh, well, that's conspiracy theory." It's like, is it though? Is it though?
I think one of my biggest takeaways from 2020 forward was anything that's a conspiracy theory, usually about 10 minutes later proves to be truth. I there's this meme I keep seeing, make conspiracy theories again. And I kind of long for that day.
I know, right? Because it's like now, I mean, the timeline's so expedited now, And the thing is, we were bringing the evidence to the table. It wasn't like we were just flying off on the handle here and just going out and, no, I'm not doing this. It's like, no, I'm not doing this. And here's why I'm not doing this. Here's the evidence, and here's the medical data, and here's the danger signals. And here's, the EUA laws, which are really black and white, and the military regulations and the Constitution, right?
That pesky little Constitution, yeah. You talked about the Frago, and I remember on Fort Leavenworth, when that came out, and all of a sudden, this was back, before the shot was required, and all of a sudden, if you had not taken this voluntary shot, you had to mask up. And I'd been sent to work in the Combined Arms Center on Fort Leavenworth, kicking and screaming, did not want to go there, but I got told that's where you're going. And so I'm wearing a mask because I'm in the building that the very general who issued this order works in. I'm literally around the corner from him. My office is maybe 70 feet away. So I'm like, I really got to, mind myself while I'm here and play according to all the rules if I don't want to attract that 3 stars ire. And I'm in the office, and I'm the only one wearing a mask because everyone else in the office enthusiastically got all their shots. They were routinely getting all their boosters, and every day there was some variation in the office of the narrative of all hail the shot, aren't we glad to the gods for the shot. And my boss pointed me in his office one day and said, "Hey, Chase." "Yes, sir." "I noticed you're wearing a mask. Have you not had time to get your second dose?" And I said, "Well, sir, I haven't got any dose because it's voluntary right now. And when I have a choice to make, I take the choice." And I was shocked. There was no discussion. There was no, "Oh, okay, I was just curious." The man literally did this. And then proceeded to essentially tell me what a fool I am. And I remember thinking to myself in that moment, this isn't about trying to protect me. This is, am I going along with a thought doctrine? And I told him, I said, "Sir, I'm not trying to make any problems here. I'm not trying to cause any waves. If it becomes mandatory, I'll get it." And that was because I was assuming if it became mandatory that they would only make it mandatory had it been properly vetted, had it been properly tested. I wanted to believe that the military I served in would check all those boxes. And so when I said if it becomes mandatory, I'll do it, because I thought if it becomes mandatory, it's because they will have done all their due diligence and they will have proven it's safe. Of course, we know that's not what happened. And it was just, yeah, I mean, that whole thing was all about putting a mark on it. It was your scarlet letter. It was go around and self-identify as you're the unclean. You are the unwashed mass. You are the unworthy one. You're the one people should be whispering about you behind your back when you walk by because you don't believe the science. And I heard there were other bases. I like one unit on Fort Bragg actually made guys put a red armband on, and other bases did all sorts of other things. I mean, this was, historically speaking, from things that have happened in the last century, this was scary.
I mean, on a humanity level, like, we're not talking military. We're not talking the United States. We're talking on humanity, right? But speaking about the military specifically, the whole anthrax thing, like, largely that was just, cordoned off to the military, right? And they love to run their experiments on the military. And that's why we had that. Out of the anthrax debacle, that's why we had these acts of legislation, acts of Congress that prevented the mandating of the emergency use authorized products, right? And yet we repeated the cycle, but we repeated it on a humanity, on the scale of humanity, right? It wasn't specifically, like, you're talking about school teachers, police officers, state employees, federal employees, children trying to attend school, forced to wear masks, forced to muzzle. You're talking every single level. And what's interesting about that too is those public servants were also protected by acts of Congress from being experimented on with emergency use authorized products, which their institution or organization or corporation blatantly violated as well. And so, I mean, on a scale we've never seen, I would argue on a scale we've never seen before. And then going back to your point of, like, the psychological aspect, where you have a commander that would do that would put his, hands over his face in disappointment because you're utilizing critical thought processing skills, simple discernment, right? Basic discernment, where it's clear that, a lot of these individuals were psychologically manipulated to do that. Like, that's a behavior out of psychological manipulation and conditioning, that whether they, depending on their information streams, which is highly effective in this whole pandemic apparatus, especially when you go back to the diagnostics tools. I always go back to the diagnostics because I'm saying, like, you got to study root cause analysis. Root cause analysis. Where did this come from? Okay, we can say, manufactured in a lab, Wuhan, China, whatever you want to say there, but was it also amplified by a weaponized diagnostic tool as well and made it way more than what it really was? Of course it was. How could it not have been? Look at the death rate. It was like a point for the military. It was like a 0.01 death rate. And then did they really die from COVID? Right? Did they really die from COVID, or did they die from something else? But in their list of causes of death have a positive COVID case, and then it got put down as a COVID death, right? Or did they really die from the experimental injection, but they tested positive with a PCR test for COVID-19, and they got put down as a COVID death, right? And we did see the spike of COVID-19 deaths coinciding with the rollout of the jab. So, I mean, all this information is there. It's just a matter of discernment and really individual choice.
Well, and you definitely cared about that individual choice, and that's kind of where your story turned and took a direction that really made you a rather high-profile name, especially in the circles in which we run. And so I'd like to kind of jump in and into that part of your life. You've been ordered now. You're going to be having to take these these swabs, and they're just, I mean, for anyone who's never had to take those tests, they're just awful. I mean, they're painful, literally physically painful. And you had to take that, and you had to wear a mask in order to come into your place of duty. And we're soldiers. We come into our place of duty. It's what we do, right? And you weren't playing that game.
Right. It's you're especially officers. You're appointed as an officer, right? And then you're commissioned as an officer, and then everybody gets orders to an assigned place of duty. Nowhere on my orders was my assigned place of duty on my couch teleworking. I have soldiers I had to lead. In fact, I had laboratory duties I was conducting, and I can't conduct those from sitting at home teleworking on my couch. So it's like, no, like I'm going in with my soldiers to conduct my duties, right? And the moment I did that, yeah, I mean, everything, it revoked my security access, right? I was banned from my place of duty for 413 days. Not able to enter, unescorted, I was not able to enter Army Public Health Center facility for 413 days. I wasn't even given, when they gave me access back, they formally took my access back, but when they gave me my access back, they made an enlisted service member hand me my security access badge to access facilities. They didn't even have the guts to formally document it on paper, right? They handed it to an enlisted member to give me, and then they gave me duties, very, I would call it a humiliation ritual, which they gave me duties inspecting eye wash showers, right? at a laboratory. That was my duty. Show up and inspect eye wash showers as a commissioned officer, where you're assigned as a medical entomologist to do preventive medicine, risk communication. But now, after this whole thing, now your job, we'll give you your access back, but you've got to inspect eye wash showers. So they did that. Weaponization of behavioral health, escorted to me behavioral health, right? And for no reason at all. There was no reason that they could point to that would require them to escort me to behavioral health, yet they did it, right? The list goes on and on. Threatened me with Leavenworth imprisonment, right? So they threatened me with Leavenworth imprisonment, say, hey, when you show up to your court-martial, you need to have your bags packed for Leavenworth. Like, oh, okay. Can you send me that packing list? Sends me the packing list for Leavenworth. I then go to the BX and start picking up my packing list for Leavenworth, right? And then all of a sudden, after I shared a little video about my experience of shopping for my items on that Leavenworth packing list, and I shared it publicly, all of a sudden I get an email back, hey, you know what? Don't worry about it. You no longer need a packing list to Leavenworth. What's that all about, right? Another coercive humiliation tactic, right, that you're going to use against me to try to break me down. And I don't know, because they've never had to answer for this criminal activity. I've had to answer for my actions. I've taken responsibility for my actions. Yes, I showed up to my place of duty unmasked, untested, uninjected with an experimental serum, right, to perform my duties alongside my soldiers. I take responsibility for that. I got found guilty in a court-martial for doing that, right? Judge gave me no punishment. It came to sentencing, and the judge said no punishment, and I'll do one further. I'll even recommend to the commanding general to drop everything. And what did they do? They didn't drop everything. They didn't take the judge's recommendation. They doubled down and initiated an officer elimination after 17 years of my service, in which I appealed, I rebutted, I fought for the next year, all the way up to the Secretary of the Army at the time. And then they finally pushed me out of service. But they had every piece of documentation. They had all my protected communication. They they had the ability to do the right thing the entire time, and they chose to break federal law, military regulation, whistleblower reprisal acts of legislation of Congress, right? Their oaths to the Constitution and to protect against enemies, foreign and domestic. They chose that. They chose that. I just chose to show up to my duty and perform my duties as I was appointed, as I was assigned. And so that's, I could go into more details, but that's the gist of it.
Now, you're the only one who actually was court-martialed over this, if I recall correctly. Is that right?
Yeah, I think there were other individuals that were definitely going to go to a court-martial. I don't know what played out with that. I think for the jab specifically, one of the NDAs came out and prevented court-martial for the quote-unquote vaccines. If you remember, I think it was 2022. Or no, I think it was the NDA for, 2022 NDA prevented court-martials for the vaccine. But here's the problem. One, it wasn't a vaccine. It was an emergency use authorized product. And that also includes the masking and the testing, because they're also emergency use authorized products per the FDA, right? And so you can't talk about one without the other, but yet we're in that place of always talking about one with the other. Like, so, the whole solely argument, this and that, it's like, no. The mandates, the unlawful mandates, the masking, the testing, the injections, right? The emergency use authorized products. Why is that so critical? Because it goes back to laws and orders, lawful orders, unlawful orders, all those things, and the distinction between.
And who was it that recommended your court-martial?
It was Colonel Yevgeny Vindman. So Colonel Yevgeny Vindman recommended the court-martial. So it was my commander that recommended a court-martial according to documentation. Then it goes to the garrison commander. The garrison commander recommended NJP, which was like Article 15. And then it went to Yevgeny Vindman, who was the staff judge advocate for the base, and he recommended court-martial. So it went court-martial. And he had my Article 138. They dismissed my Article 138 on 19 January 2022. The day after, they charged me formally and notified me of court-martial, right? So they had my protected communications the entire time.
And for context, for Yevgeny Vindman is the brother of Alexander Vindman. You can easily Google either of them. Alexander Vindman worked in the National Security Council during the first Trump administration and is largely reported to be the one who kind of helped to get the whole Russiagate story going, and has just been nothing but an antagonist ever since. And his brother, Eugene Vindman, who prosecuted your case, once they won at court-martial, you made a point of saying that the judge recommended no punishment at all. It seems like the judge had some scruples about him and saw this command had really overreached and was trying to make an example. And Vindman went and bragged about it.
Yeah, I can only speculate about what the judge was thinking and what was happening in his chambers or his chain of command. I can only speculate. However, my speculation is that when I sat on that stand and I got cross-examined, I looked that judge in the eyes and I said, "Sir, there are danger signals in the database with these experimental emergency use authorized products, right? The masking, the testing, the injections, they're all emergency use authorized products. And specifically, there were danger signals in the database related to those, which I was and still am communicating up my chain of command." And my speculation is he realized I was a protected communicator. And at that point in time, probably didn't want anything to do with a punishment for that. And so punted the football back to the commanding general to do the right thing, which is like, hey, like really, like drop all this. Like you, and then they doubled down and tripled down for the next year until they finally washed me out of service. So, yeah, going back to what you said, right, the day I was convicted, and the day the court martial was concluded, which was 29 April 2022, Eugene Vindman goes out, and he was the colonel at the time, the staff judge advocate, the lead prosecutor in charge of the prosecutors for this court martial, goes out on his public X account and brags about the conviction, first ever conviction of a officer who violated DOD COVID-19 protocols.
Yeah, I've
right?
actually got it right here. Proud of the prosecution team at Aberdeen Proving Ground. Secured a first-in-the-nation conviction at court-martial of a lieutenant who failed to obey lawful orders re-COVID mitigation measures. Guilty on all 3 counts. At Y. Vindman 4/29/22. And I remember seeing that and thinking, holy cow, when does a prosecutor get on X and brag about something like that?
Well, when it's political, right? When he turns it into a political spectacle. And, oh, by the way, not lawful, right? Unlawful. The DOD even says this at this point in time. Unlawful as implemented, right? So not lawful. And then number 2, this individual, because he was clearly playing, weaponizing this whole system, the whole chain of command and his power as staff judge advocate to position himself politically. And he now is a elected House of Representatives, District 7, Virginia, and sits on the House Armed Services Committee right now, actively. Like, this is, that's ridiculous. Like, at the very least, I would say there needs to be a call for him to be removed from the House Armed Services Committee at the very least, right? We all know, what actually needs to happen, which is, he had protected communication. He knowingly violated federal law. So
I know neither of us can get inside his head. We can only theorize. But I'll tell you, I looked at the date of this. This is the end of April of 2022. Within 2 years, he is running for a seat in Congress in a different state, by the way. And I couldn't help but think when I saw that he filed to run that he was using this to get his name in the news.
Well, that's an interesting point you bring up, because I want to say it was February 2nd, 2022. I get an email from my attorney saying, hey, they're going to run this story in the news, Army Times, Winky, whatever his, I don't know if you're, Davis Winky, right? Run this story in the Army Times. They're going to run this story. We got to come up with maybe an opportunity to comment. And I was like, great, like, we need to say what's really going on here. Before we could even respond back, guess what? They published the story. So he feeds his boy, again, this is speculation. I don't know this to be true. This is, again, my opinion. He feeds an individual at the Army Times this story. They run with it before even reaching out to me or my attorney for comment. They reached out like after it was already published. None of us, I never went to the media, right? Because I'm a strict believer in the chain of command. It goes back to the processes we have with the chain of command. We have processes to redress our grievances as service members. And I consider the court of public opinion as a service member the absolute last resort, right? It's, and so the court martial gets done. Again, more articles go out. And at that point in time, after utilizing my chain of command about this issue to the point of a court martial, I'm like, all right, now we're going to tell the story of what really is going on here. And I utilized the chain of command all the way up to the Secretary of the Army. I didn't skip a step. Did not skip a step. Used it all the way up to the Secretary of the Army to no avail. And so, yeah, they love to, that political points of feeding their media apparatuses their version of the story, but the media apparatus is never actually digging in and doing any sort of journalistic integrity to figure out what really is going on here. I mean, you would think, like, wait a second, we got a medical officer, a preventive officer medical officer at the Army Public Health Center, a medical entomologist, right? Preventive medicine. And he's getting court-martialed over refusing to participate with the jabs, testing, and masking. Like, wouldn't we want to know more? Like, wouldn't we want to talk to him? Figure out what's really going on here? No, of course not. Because the media was in on it too.
Oh, they absolutely were. I mean, I was a PAO for 20 years, every year, enlisted and commissioned. And I found out very quickly, like when you're working with local media at local regional level, it's great. There's some really good people there. When you get up at the national capital region level, it's very, very, very hard to find a good, honest broker. There are a few, but they're a remnant. And specifically like Army Times, Task and Purpose, military.com, PAOs who are street smart are well aware that, be very careful around those. I could do a whole show just talking about that, but I won't take your time on that. I'm kind of curious, after the court-martial, the judge recommends your command let this thing go. They don't, and I really want to stomp on that so that people who may not be as familiar understand that in the military justice system, the findings of a judge or the findings of a jury are really merely recommendations, because it all goes back to the commander who decides what is the commander actually going to do. And the commander has the power to completely ignore the judicial outcome and say, okay, cool, but that's not what I want to do. I want to do this instead. And that's exactly what happened in your case.
And there's plenty of examples of that, like egregious examples of that, right? Where a commander ignores the recommendation of a judge. For example, a service member rapes another service member or somebody, right? There's examples of those egregious acts, and then a commander not following through with the recommendation for punishment for those egregious acts, right? But in this case, I didn't actually break any laws, right? They charged me with Article 92, which is the violation of a lawful order. But the order wasn't based in any law. There is no law that says you have to mask, test, and participate with experimental injections, right? It's actually the opposite. It protects you from those products. And so there was no law that you could cite that you could say, okay, violation of a lawful order. Yeah, but what is that lawful order based in? And we know now, again, we knew then, but the DOD came out now, specifically back in May of 2025, and said, yep, unlawful as implemented. So you got the largest government agency in the entire world, Department of Defense, just came out and said the mandate for the COVID-19 injections among United States service members was unlawfully implemented. If it was unlawfully implemented for the United States service member, it was unlawfully implemented for every public entity within the nation, period. So that's kind of a big deal, huge deal.
No, it absolutely is. I'm kind of curious. You stood firm. They were determined to still push you out, and I've got to imagine they must have along the way dangled some kind of carrot, and said, "Hey, man, if you'll just play along with us." Did they, or was it just we've determined that we're going to push you out?
Oh, you want to know what their carrot was? Hey, they called me up after the court martial. It was probably 2-3 weeks after the court martial, and they say, hey, we got to get on a counseling session. We need you to call in. So I call in. They said, hey, at this time, we've lost confidence of you as an officer, and we're pushing with your officer elimination. However, you can resign your commission. That's the carrot. Resign your commission. It was like an easy answer for me. I've got a duty. I swore an oath to the Constitution against enemies, foreign and domestic, to uphold the laws, military regulations, all of that. I can't resign my commission. How am I supposed to resign my commission to that? Like, you violated the law. I was upholding the law. And you want me to resign my commission? That was their carrot.
Wow. No honor at all.
No.
Wow. Feel free if you want to name drop in here. I'm all about it.
I mean, I'll name drop the general, right? General Edmondson, senior mission commander, Aberdeen Proving Grounds, also in charge of the bio-defense vaccination program for the entire military, right? Fort Detrick.
Is that general still in?
No, he retired, right? Of course. Eugene Vindman, right? The staff judge advocate. And then we get lower. I'm not going to go lower than that at this point in time. But
I'm kind of curious, you've since been pardoned. That came out just a few weeks ago. What was that like getting was there a phone call from the White House? How does that work?
Yeah, so I got kind of a heads up by a warrior by the name of Casey Dixon. She was a former U.S. Air Force JAG who held the line and stood strong during the mandates and really is a warrior. And she gave me a heads up because she was advocating for the pardon of this ridiculous conviction. And she said, hey, just a heads up, the White House might call today. And I thought they were going to call and maybe they wanted more information. Maybe, she did submit a lot of information, all my evidence and things like that. But maybe, there was maybe a conversation. But so sure enough, I want to say it was like mid-afternoon. I get a call, Washington, D.C. on my phone, answer it. Colonel Matthews and Elise Johnson. So Colonel Matthews, Earl Matthews, former colonel for the D.C. National Guard, retired and was working White House counsel at the time. And then Elise Johnson, as the pardon czar, called me on my phone and congratulated me and informed me that President Trump's given me a full presidential pardon for the conviction in the court-martial. And that was surreal. It's still, surreal. But it kind of goes back to, just knowing that the president knows the situation and of the weaponization of the mandates is huge, and he was willing to do that, and incredibly blessed and appreciative of that. And so I've since used that and sent that pardon warrant to the Army Board of Military Corrections. I sent it back the day after I got it, and we're still waiting on that adjudication for the corrections of military record and maybe some further steps as far as that goes.
It seemed to me like when the president gives a pardon that the Army would just automatically update their records. I'm astounded at how they continue to put the onus on the people who are wronged to request that.
Oh, it's wild. I mean, the amount of evidence they have, and they've had this entire time since April 29, 2022, and the fact that I still have to I still went through and showing a preponderance of evidence of the unlawfulness, the illegality, the immoral, unethical aspect of all this is wild to me, and we still don't have an answer. In fact, the president signed an executive order back in January 27th of 2025 for reinstating service members of these unlawful mandates. It's August right now, and I know some individuals that are getting ready to get orders, but they still haven't been processed back into military service. Like I can't name a single one. And I know the office of this Undersecretary of Defense is working on this. It's a big issue. It'll continuously be a big issue until they get this right. I mean, I just don't understand. I will give certain individuals a grace period because they did just get confirmed by the Senate, and that took an immense time, right? But the clock is ticking, and it's been ticking. And again, why is the onus on these unlawfully discharged to go through and explain themselves to such a degree when there's an executive order in place? Like, how about we follow the lawful orders now, right? I don't know. I can't answer a lot of things in that regard, but it's going to be interesting to see it play out.
If they gave you a chance to serve again, would you do it?
I love service. I'm open to service. And if they gave me that opportunity, I would certainly entertain it. And through prayer and supplication, prayer in my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, it's only that prayer, that meaningful prayer and giving it over, would I actually know the answer to that question.
Fair enough. Couple last questions here as we wrap up, Mark. First off, where can people follow you, get in touch, continue watching your journey?
Yeah, so I have an X account. It's at I think it's at MC Bashaw, and then you can also go to a website I created to kind of release some of this protected communication so the individuals, the audience out there, can read it for themselves. And that's freedomfighter1776.com. If you go over there, you can see the pardon warrant. You can see the protected communication. You can see some interviews and also some other individuals, highlighting some other individuals, many other individuals that have been standing up, whether they were a school teacher, whether they're a state trooper, right? A sheriff. There's so many warriors at every aspect of public service that stood up that, I mean, these are salt of the earth type people, and these are the people that we need to be uplifting and putting in positions to help run our form of government, in my opinion. So check that out.
Okay, will do. And last question. This podcast is all about courage. You're a courageous guy. Who's the bravest person you know?
Bravest person I know. I would say my wife. My wife's pretty badass. She's a warrior. I think that's a good answer. You know what I'm saying? My wife.
Can't go wrong giving credit to the wife.
Heck yeah, man. She has been there throughout this entire process. She's been standing up herself in public service, in uniform service, as a warrior. And she supported me through and through. My wife. Gotta give it to her.
That's awesome. You know what? That's a theme that I'm starting to pick up is the importance of a husband or a wife standing right there with the warrior in the fight. And so cannot say I'm in any way surprised to hear that you found that same kind of a steadfast comfort. That's awesome, man. Well, Mark, I admire you. I've admired you for a long time. I'm really honored that you were willing to spend this time with me today. You've been a lot of places, so I appreciate that you're willing to come on this show and share your story. And, man, you've inspired me, and I know you're going to inspire others as well.
Well, likewise, man. I appreciate you having me on and what you're doing and the stand you're taking and the public information you're putting out there. I mean, you're a warrior, man, and I really do appreciate you having me on the show, and I sincerely respect what you're doing.
Well, thanks, man. It's an honor. I'm coming to you from the Herzog Foundation studios today in Smithville, Missouri. To learn more about the Herzog Foundation and the amazing work they do to catalyze Christian education nationwide, head on over to herzogfoundation.com. If you'd like to learn more about me and my work, you can check it out at chasespears.com. I'm really honored to use this series to bring amazing voices like Mark's to you, to show you what courage looks like. Now it's up to you to find your spine. So let's get to it. I'm Chase Spears. Thanks for listening.
Remember to like and subscribe so you never miss an episode. And we'll see you next time on Finding Your Spine.